Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 16, The German Concentration in the West. An acute crisis in manpower followed the prodigal campaign of 1917, and a prolonged and searching examination of our remaining resources was made by the War Cabinet. The British infantry, on whom the brunt of the slaughter had fallen, were woefully depleted. The battalions were far below their proper strength, and even so largely composed of new drafts. The losses of the artillery, both in men and guns, destroyed, were also most severe. The loss in officers was out of all proportion even to the great losses of the rank and file. The task had throughout demanded an unprecedented degree of sacrifice from regimental officers. More than 5,000 had been killed outright, and over 15,000 had been wounded in the Passchendaele offensive. This loss was especially difficult to replace, could never in fact be fully replaced. We had every reason to expect that the main fighting of 1918 in France would fall upon Great Britain. The French, who had begun with the unequaled slaughter of 1914 and had ever since been engaged on a scale of nearly 120 divisions, must necessarily and naturally be expected to reserve their remaining strength, grand it proved to be, for supreme emergencies. It was now certain that the United States, in spite of their utmost efforts and passionate desire to share the suffering, could not play more than a minor part in the actual battles. Only 8 or 9 American divisions were in fact due to enter the line before the summer was far spent. Substantial help had been sent per force from the Western Front to Italy, and none could be expected in return. We had also almost the whole burden of the war against Turkey on our hands. And Allenby, so far from being able to release divisions, was continually pressing not only for drafts, but for reinforcements. Additional forces, both British and Indian, were required for the army in Mesopotamia. And finally, the Salonika front, on which we bore our share, was a constant drain. It was in these grave circumstances that we had to anticipate a German onslaught far exceeding in power and fury anything that had yet been experienced. The final collapse of Russia had liberated enormous masses of German and Austrian troops. During the whole of the winter, the movement of divisions and guns from the eastern to the western front, and to a lesser extent against Italy, was unceasing. How great this movement actually was, we could not measure exactly, but the intelligence reports with which I endeavored to saturate myself revealed week after week an unending flow of men and material to the west. Surveying the forces on both sides in the main theater, it could not be doubted that by the spring Germany would have for the first time in the war, not even excepting the original invasion, a large numerical preponderance on the Western Front. Moreover, the divisions coming from Russia would, by the opening of the new campaign, have had nearly a year without serious fighting in which to recuperate and train. All our fighting units, on the other hand, had been decimated 5-fold in the last 6 months of 1917. Finally, in addition to the masses of German and Austrian artillery released from the Russian front, the enemy had captured at least 4,000 guns from Russia and 2,000 from Italy, together with immense supplies of war material of all kinds. Sir Douglas Haig vehemently and naturally called for all the officers and men required to bring his divisions up to full strength at the earliest possible moment. Robertson supported him, and was evidently seriously alarmed. From my central position between the army and the War Cabinet, with, I believe, the whole information available in my possession, and with constant intimate access to the Prime Minister, I never ceased to press for the immediate reinforcement of Sir Douglas Haig. Mr. Lloyd George viewed with horror the task imposed on him of driving to the shambles by stern laws the remaining manhood of the nation. Lads of 18 and 19, elderly men up to 45, the last surviving brother, the only son of his mother, and she a widow, the father, the sole support of the family, the weak, the consumptive, the thrice wounded, all must now prepare themselves for the scythe. To meet the German onslaught when it came, if it came, everything must be thrown in, but the Prime Minister feared lest our last resources should be expended in another Passchendaele. It was in December that the shadow fell darkly upon the military mind. Up till then the cabinet had been assured that all was going well in the West, and that, granted the drafts, the new year could be faced with confidence. At the Ministry of Munitions we had long been instructed to prepare for a renewed 30 weeks offensive beginning in the earliest spring. With the end of Passchendaele came the end of illusions. The sudden sinister impression was sustained by the General Staff. The cry for a fresh offensive died away. The mood swung round to pure defense, and against heavy odds. It was a revolution at once silent and complete. I responded to it with instant relief. The War Cabinet, however, continued for some time to rest themselves upon the confident declarations of the generals made in September in advocacy of perseverance at Passchendaele. They did not readily conform to the military volte-face, and with skeptical of tales so utterly of variance with those of a few weeks before, and were skeptical of tales so utterly at variance with those of a few weeks before. I urged that the cabinet should send all the men that were needed to reconstitute the army, and should at the same time forbid absolutely any resumption of the offensive. The Prime Minister, however, did not feel that, if the troops were once in France, he would be strong enough to resist those military pressures for an offensive which had so often overborne the wiser judgment of statesmen. He therefore held, with all his potent influence, to a different policy. He sanctioned only a moderate reinforcement of the army, while at the same time gathering in England the largest possible numbers of reserves. In this way he believed he would be able alike to prevent a British offensive and to feed the armies during the whole course of the fearful year which was approaching. This was in fact achieved, but I held, and hold still, that the War Cabinet should have been resolute, as I believe it would have been found strong enough at once to support and to restrain the High Command in France. I set forth in the following secret memorandum my views in detail. Manpower and the situation. To the War Cabinet. December 8, 1917. First, it is not possible to settle the question of manpower without a clear idea of the plan of campaign. The Ministry of National Service is naturally bound to tabulate the demands of the various departments, set their existing resources against them, and show the resulting deficit. But these demands are a mere aggregate of separate and independent departmental requirements, and not, as they should be, the expression of a general scheme of war. If a plan of campaign suited to the actual facts of next year, as far as we can foresee them, were made out, it seems certain to me that the total demand could be substantially reduced. Second, for instance, the calculations of military requirements have been based upon a continuance of the kind of offensive action which we have pursued during the last 2 years, whereas the balance of forces next year will clearly not permit a continuance of that policy on the same scale nor to the same degree. It is vital to us to have in the field at the opening of the spring campaign a British army stronger and better equipped than we have ever had before, because the burden thrown upon it is going to be greater than before. On the other hand, this army, once raised and restored to its full efficiency and strength, must be husbanded and not consumed. It must be an army crouched and not sprawled, an army with a large proportion of divisions in reserve at full strength, resting and training, an army sustained by every form of mechanical equipment, including especially tanks and aeroplanes, and possessing the greatest possible lateral mobility. What is required, therefore, is an immediate large draft of men to raise the army to its fullest strength and to give it the greatest possible springing power and striking power. At the same time, this power, when gained, must be scrupulously and jealously guarded and even hoarded, and not reduced or impaired except to meet vital emergencies. These two aspects must be kept simultaneously in mind. A. An immediate raising of the army to the highest possible strength, and B. Its jealous conservation when raised. Our role and only chance of escaping defeat is to bridge the long intervening month before the Americans can become a decisive factor, and as we cannot tell what emergencies we may have to meet in the meanwhile, we must not only mobilize our greatest possible strength, but keep it in hand to guard against unforeseeable contingencies. Third, to say that we should raise our army to the highest possible offensive power by no means implies that it should be immediately launched upon a general offensive. To say, on the other hand, that the general role of the British armies will be an active defense by no means precludes the striking of sudden heavy blows on our own initiative, nor the power of vehement counterattack. There is, therefore, great scope of a certain number of brilliant military episodes of first-rate importance. The dominant principle, however, from which there must be no swerving, is that we shall be a holding force, endeavoring to maintain, with the least possible loss, a situation which cannot be improved decisively except by the arrival of a great American army. Fifth, a commander-in-chief in the field is entitled to know from his government A. What his general role is to be, B. What are to be his monthly incomes of men and shell tonnage, C. What condition the army is to be left in at the end of the campaign in point of numbers and efficiency. Within these limits his discretion should be unfettered. Sixth, the Ministry of National Service assumes that the demand of the Navy for 90,000 additional men should have priority above army needs, and he makes apparently no provision for combining or dilution, either in the Navy or in its civil establishments. Again, it is to be observed that the naval demands for men cannot be considered except in reference to the general plan of war. If the Navy had plans for offensive or amphibious action which might be expected to cause the enemy to withdraw large numbers of men from the existing battlefronts, justification for a substantial increase in the manpower at their disposal would be provided. But if, as may well be, it is considered that there are no prudent and practicable means of using the Navy in this manner, then it is difficult to see what good reasons there can be to increase the number of men at the disposal of the Admiralty. We are far stronger in proportion to the German fleet than we were at the beginning of the war, when they did not venture to attack us. We are probably employing, apart from shipbuilding, 3 or 4 times as many men for naval purposes as they are, and in addition to this, besides the navies of the European allies, there is the American fleet, the 3rd strongest in the world. There are many more detailed aspects of the use of naval personnel which demand instructed and critical examination. In a crisis like this, every man counts, and no department or branch of our fighting forces has a right to special privileges. The construction of warships other than for anti-submarine warfare also makes a heavy demand on labor and valuable materials. Seventh, there are at present employed on shipbuilding and munitions work over 3 million men and women, A plan can be submitted for providing from this total 100,000 Category A men for the Army. The plan would include the clean cut for Category A, men below the age of 24 who are estimated at about 55,000 in munitions and shipbuilding. The loss on shipbuilding and marine engineering would have to be made good by transferring older men from other munitions work. This would be practicable. Ninth, the next great resource of manpower, which should now be drawn upon, is the army at home. This at present comprises upwards of 1,400,000 men who are explained or excused in various ways. In order that this resource shall be rendered effective for the armies on the Western Front, we must face the institution of defensive battalions for holding quiet and non-significant sectors of the line. The actual military arrangements obviously require careful but not necessarily prolonged study. 150 battalions of 1,000 men each could certainly be obtained from this source and woven into our scheme for maintaining the Western Front and the efficiency of our armies next year. 10th. I have already drawn attention to the extraordinary increase in the standards of home defense against invasion which has taken place since the early periods of the war. The continental military crisis now is as intense as it was in the days of the Marne and the Yser. There is no reason to assume that invasion is less impossible now than it was then. There are in fact a wealth of reasons to the contrary, which could easily be stated if desired. It is a fair proposition that, apart from any men taken in the shape of garrison battalions from the troops at home not included in the home defense forces, there should also be at least 50,000 men taken, say, in brigades from the existing home defense forces and used for holding quiet sectors of the front in France. The garrison of Ireland requires to be reconsidered from the point of view of the actual work it might have to do. That is to say, not the conduct of military operations in the ordinary sense, but the suppression of sporadic disorders and local rebellions. Armored motor cars, machine gun cyclists, the older pattern of aeroplanes, and a few tanks for street fighting seem to be features which require special development. It is for consideration whether 10,000 serviceable men could not be found from this source for service in ordinary or in garrison battalions abroad. The total available from the military forces in Great Britain and Ireland should not be estimated at less than 210,000 men. 11th. Mechanical engines afford an important means of multiplying manpower. The tanks have proved themselves in appropriate circumstances not only to be a substitute for bombardment, but an indispensable adjunct to infantry. In the attack in Flanders we gained 54 square miles with an expenditure of 465,000 tons of ammunition, costing £84 million, and probably over 300,000 casualties. The offensive at Cambrai, depending as it did entirely upon the surprise use of tanks on a large scale, gained 42 square miles with an expenditure of 36,000 tons of shell, costing £6,600,000, and with a loss of life which, had the operation been confined to its early and fruitful stage, would have not exceeded 10,000 casualties. Footnote: it was actually much less. End of footnote. There is much to be said in modification of crude figures and comparisons of this kind, but when everything has been said, the conclusion presented is overwhelming. Powerful as the tanks have proved themselves in surprise offensives on suitable ground, they are still more vulnerable in counterattack. In this case, they would be moving over ground with which they were unfamiliar, and against an enemy necessarily unprepared with any special arrangements to receive them. They are immune from panic, and in their advance must carry forward with them the infantry counterattack. It would be lamentable if, for want of men at this stage of the war and with its lessons so cruelly written, we should not be allowed to develop these weapons to our highest manufacturing capacity. Are we really to keep in being, at a time when every man is precious, when every ton of stores counts, 30,000 or 40,000 cavalry with their horses, when these admirable cavalrymen would supply the personnel for the greatest development of mechanical warfare, both for offense and defense in tanks, in armored cars, and on motorcycles, that has ever yet been conceived. 12th. To sum up, the following proposals are put forward as a basis for examination. Sir Auckland Geddes' figures show that without resource to fresh legislation, there is a deficit on existing naval and military demands of approximately 645,000 men. It is suggested that this should be met as follows: A. Reduction of monthly wastage through the adoption of an active defense in the place of the continuous offensive of this year. 6 months at 30,000 a month instead of 50,000, equals 120,000. B. The Navy living on its own and through American resources. Reduced demand, 90,000. C. Munitions and shipbuilding, no diminution in total shipbuilding, equals 100,000. D. Garrison battalions of soldiers serving at home, 150,000. E. Garrison or sedentary brigades or divisions from home defense and Ireland, 60,000. F. Coal mines, agriculture, railways, and balance of men as proposed by Sir Auckland Geddes, 80,000. In total, 600,000. 13th. It is worthwhile considering other resources or manpower to which we should look, not merely as alternatives, but as supplements and additions. That is, A. Raising the age to 50, as has long been done in Germany, Austria and France, apart from larger numbers available for defensive units. 110,000. B. Extending compulsion to Ireland. 200,000. C. American troops training, first in platoons, then in companies, and next in battalions, with the British Army, 200 battalions, equals 200,000. D. Developments of mechanical warfare and lateral mobility multiply men, but cannot be numerically appraised. 14th. It is clear that with these extensive and varied resources at our disposal, we have the means of meeting the prime need of the situation, that is, to meet the spring campaign with the British Army stronger in every respect than any we have previously put in the field. All its units full, a large proportion of divisions resting and training, thus giving us a strategic reserve, in the Prime Minister's phrase, an army of maneuver. An unprecedented development of mechanical and aeronautical warfare, and very large labor forces for defensive works, communications, and services behind the line. This can certainly be done if action is taken now in the same spirit as it would be undoubtedly taken, and has in most cases been already taken, by the enemy with whom we are fighting. Moreover, it can be done without interfering in any serious degree with our war against the submarines, with our defense against invasion, or with our production of munitions. Nearly all these specific measures, which were at this time contrary to the views of the War Cabinet, were taken or resolved on after the catastrophe of March 21. Taken in January, they would have prevented it. I also made under all proper guard a speech at Bedford on December 11 in the same sense. 2 months ago I stated in London that the war was entering upon its sternest phase, but I must admit that the situation at this moment is more serious than it was reasonable 2 months ago to expect. The country is in danger, as it has not been since the Battle of the Marne saved Paris, and the battles of Ypres and of the Yser saved the Channel ports. The cause of the Allies is now in danger. The future of the British Empire and of democracy and of civilization hang, and will continue to hang, for a considerable period, in a balance and an anxious suspense. It is impossible, even if it were desirable, to conceal these facts from our enemies. It would be folly not to face them boldly ourselves. Anyone can see for himself what has happened in Russia. Russia has been thoroughly beaten by the Germans. Her great heart has been broken, not only by German might, but by German intrigue, not only by German steel, but by German gold. Russia has fallen on the ground prostrate in exhaustion and in agony. No one can tell what fearful vicissitudes will come to Russia, or how or when she will arise, but arise she will. It is this melancholy event which has prolonged the war, that has robbed the French, the British, and the Italian armies of the prize that was perhaps almost within their reach this summer. It is this event, and this event alone, that has exposed us to perils and sorrows and sufferings which we have not deserved, which we cannot avoid, but under which we shall not bend. There never was a moment in this war when the practical steps which we ought to take showed themselves more plainly, or when the choice presented to us was so brutally clear as it is tonight, or when there was less excuse for patriotic men to make the mistake of being misled by sophistries and dangerous counsels. What is the one great practical step we must take without a day's delay? We must raise the strength of our army to its highest point. A heavier strain will be thrown upon this army than it has ever had to bear before. We must see that it is stronger than it has ever been before. Do not put too heavy a burden on those heroic men by whose valiant efforts we exist from day to day. Husband their lives, conserve and accumulate their force. Every division of our army must be raised to full strength. Every service, the most scientific, the most complex, must be thoroughly provided. We must make sure that in the month to come a large proportion of our army is resting, refreshing, and training behind the front line, ready to spring like leopards upon the German hordes. Masses of guns, mountains of shells, clouds of aeroplanes, all must be ready, all must be there. We have only to act together, and we have only to act at once. These official or public arguments were reinforced by the strongest personal appeals. Nothing, however, had the slightest effect. The Prime Minister and his colleagues in the War Cabinet were adamant. Their policy was not decided without full deliberation. They were definitely opposed to any renewal of the British offensive in France. They wished the British and French armies to observe during 1918 a holding and defensive attitude. They wished to keep a tight control over their remaining manpower until the arrival of the American millions offered the prospect of decisive success. In the meanwhile, action in Palestine, with forces almost inappreciable in the scale of the Western Front, might drive Turkey out of the war and cheer the public mind during a long and grievous vigil. They were fully informed of the growing German concentration against Hague, and repeatedly discussed it. But they believed that the Germans, if they attacked, would encounter the same difficulties as had so long baffled us, and that our armies were amply strong enough for defense. Hague was accordingly left to face the spring with an army whose 56 infantry divisions were reduced from a 13 to a 10-battalion basis. Footnote, or from 12 to 9, if the Pioneer Battalion is excluded. End of footnote. And with 3 instead of 5 cavalry divisions. Footnote. 2 Indian cavalry divisions were sent from France to Palestine. End of footnote. Which, in the absence of alternative methods, were at last to render valuable service. But this was not the end of his trials. The French, also living in a world of illusions, now came forward with a vehement demand that the British should take over a larger part of the front. A cursory glance at the map shows that the French, with 100 divisions, comprising 700,000 rifles, held 480 kilometers of front, whereas 56 British divisions, comprising 504,000 rifles, only held 200 kilometers. In other words, the British, with more than two-thirds of the French rifle strength, held less than one-third of the front. But this was a very superficial test. Large portions of the French front were in continual quiescence, and the weak railway communications opposite them excluded the possibility of a serious hostile offensive. The British, on the other hand, held nearly all the most active front, and had opposite to them, even in January, a larger proportion of German divisions than were marshalled against the French army. Against the long French front were arrayed 79 German divisions, while no fewer than 69 stood before the short British sector. Moreover, the German concentration against the British front was growing week by week, and it was already extremely probable that the first and main thrust would be delivered upon them. Further, the French had not fought a heavy battle since April and May 1917, while the British army had maintained an almost continuous offensive, suffering, as we have seen, calamitous losses. Finally, the French soldier enjoyed nearly 3 times as much leave to visit his home as his British comrade. That is to say, there were in proportion 3 times as many French rifles absent from the line at any given moment as there were British. Under pressure both from the French and the British governments, Haig had agreed in December to extend his front by 14 miles as far south as Barisis, and this relief was effected in February. A further demand by the French that the British front should be extended to Berry-au-Bas, 30 miles farther southeast, though backed with the threatened resignation of Monsieur Clemenceau, was successfully resisted under a similar threat by the British commander-in-chief. The continued friction and want of confidence between Sir William Robertson and Mr. Lloyd George came to a head at the beginning of February. The Prime Minister was moving cautiously but tirelessly towards the conception of a unified command. He did not yet feel strong enough to disclose his purpose. A proposal which obviously involved placing the British armies under a French commander was one which he judged as yet beyond his strength to carry. It was a hazardous issue on which to challenge the joint resignations both of Sir William Robertson and Sir Douglas Haig. It is probable that the War Cabinet would not have been united in its support, and that the Liberal opposition would have been unanimous against it. The Prime Minister had therefore so far suspended his wishes that, speaking of an independent generalissimo, he told the House of Commons in November, "I am utterly opposed to that suggestion. It would not work. It would produce real friction, and might produce not merely friction between the armies, but friction between the nations and the governments." Nevertheless, Mr. Lloyd George continued by a series of extremely laborious and mystifying maneuvers to move steadily forward towards his solution. On January 30, at the meeting of the Supreme War Council at Versailles, he secured a decision to create a general reserve of 30 divisions and to entrust it to a committee representing Britain, Italy, the United States, and France, with General Foch at its head. This proposal constitutes his answer and that of the War Cabinet to the charge of imprudently lowering the strength of the British Army in France in the face of the growing German concentration. There is no doubt that had this plan been put immediately into execution, and had Foch been armed with 30 divisions specifically assigned to the support of whatever part of the front was attacked, larger resources would have been secured to Haig in his approaching hour of supreme need. Haig did not, however, welcome the proposal. He declared that he had no divisions to spare for the general reserve, and that there were not even enough for the various army fronts. In such circumstances, the earmarking of particular British divisions for service elsewhere could have been little more than a formality. None could have been taken from him unless the attack fell elsewhere. The decision, like many others of the Supreme War Council, remained a dead letter, and events moved forward without the British Army receiving either the reinforcements for which Haig had pleaded or the reserves which Lloyd George had labored to supply. Although the 30 divisions were lacking, the Executive Committee to control them at Versailles was created. Sir William Robertson claimed that he, as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, should alone represent Great Britain upon it. This raised an issue upon which the Prime Minister felt himself strong enough to engage. He declared it a matter of fundamental principle that the two posts could not be held by one man. It was his undoubted intention to arm the cabinet with an alternative set of military advisers whose opinions could be used to curb and correct the Robertson-Haig view, and so prevent a repetition of offensives like Passchendaele. No doubt he would also have used the new body to promote schemes of war outside the Western Front. The arrangement was indefensible in principle, but in the aftermath of Passchendaele, its objects were worthy. Into the complications of the dispute and its maneuvers it is not necessary to enter here. On February 11, Robertson, returning to London, which he had somewhat imprudently quitted for a few days, was confronted by the Secretary of State for War with a note signed on February 9 by the Prime Minister. This reduced the functions of the CIGS to the limits which had existed before the Kitchener breakdown, and it prescribed the independent functions of the British military representative on the Versailles Committee. Thirdly, it nominated Sir William Robertson, military representative, and Sir Henry Wilson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. Robertson, astonished at his supersession, declined the appointment to Versailles on the ground that the arrangement was unsound. The post of CIGS, although originally designed for Wilson, was then incontinentally offered to Sir Herbert Plumer, who, with equal promptitude, refused it. Finally, it was offered again to Robertson on the reduced basis of the Prime Minister's note. On February 16, Robertson recorded his refusal to agree to the conditions prescribed, and that same evening the official press bureau announced that the governments had accepted his resignation. He had in fact been dismissed. Lord Derby, who did his best to compose the differences, also proffered his resignation, which was not accepted. The principle of military duty on which Sir Douglas Haig invariably proceeded prevented him, even at this time of tension with the government, from adding his own resignation to the dismissal of the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. On questions which, in his view, involved the safety of the British armies under his command, Sir Douglas Haig, right or wrong, was, whenever necessary, ready to resign. But these constituted the sole exceptions which he allowed himself to make in his obedience. Had any motive of personal intrigue been present in his mind, the crisis between the High Command and the civil power would have been gravely aggravated. The position of the government at this time was strong, and the issue one on which they could rely on public support. The Prime Minister did not flinch. Nevertheless, Haig's retention, without comment, of his post was received with relief by the anxious War Cabinet, and Sir Henry Wilson was speedily appointed to the vacant chair in Whitehall. It would certainly not be just to assume in these transactions that any of the parties were influenced otherwise than by public duty. But beneath the bald record of events the clash is plain. Both the Prime Minister and Sir William Robertson were in deadly earnest, both measured forces, and both knew the risks they ran. It was impossible for the two men to work together any longer. The situation at the center of power had become intolerable. Action was long overdue. It was a pity it could not have taken a simpler form. Sir William Robertson was an outstanding military personality. His vision as a strategist was not profound, but his outlook was clear, well drilled and practical. During his tenure, he had reintroduced orderly methods of dealing with War Office problems and had revivified the General Staff system. He had no ideas of his own, but a sensible judgment, negative in bias. He represented professional formalism expressed in the plainest terms. He held a conception of war policy wholly opposed to the views set out in these volumes, but honestly and consistently maintained. I was glad, as Secretary of State for War, when, after the victory, he eventually retired from the army, to submit a recommendation to the King which enabled his long and honorable career from the rank of a private soldier to the end with the baton of a field marshal. In the stresses of this internal disturbance I took no part. I was on the front during the whole week, busily occupied, and it was only on my return that I learned the inner facts from various actors in the drama. The view which I took of my own work made it necessary for me to keep continually in touch with the actual conditions of the fighting line. The Commander-in-Chief accorded me the fullest liberty of movement in the British zone, and placed every facility at my disposal. I was most anxious to understand by personal observation the latest methods of holding the line which were involved in the preparations for a great defensive battle. I stayed with General Lipset, commanding the 3rd Canadian Division, and under his deeply instructed guidance examined minutely, from front to rear, the whole of the sector which he occupied opposite to Lens. Very different was the state of the line from what I had known it to be when serving with the Guards in 1915 or as a battalion commander in 1916. The system of continuous trenches, with their barbed wire networks, their parapets, firing steps, traverses, and dugouts, the first line of which was manned in great strength and often constituted the strongest line of resistance, had vanished. Contact with the enemy was maintained only by a fringe of outposts, some of which were fortified, while others trusted merely to concealment. Behind these, over a distance of 2,000 or 3,000 yards, were sited intricate systems of machine gun nests, nearly all operating by flank fire and mutually supporting each other. Slender communication trenches enabled these to be approached and relieved by night. The barbed wire networks, instead of being drawn laterally in a continuous belt across the front, lay obliquely, with intervals so as to draw the attackers into avenues mercilessly swept by machine gun fire. Open spaces between important points were reserved for the full fury of the protecting barrages. This was the battle zone. 2,000 yards or so farther in the rear were the field battery positions, strong works to which the long disused word redoubt was applied, and deep grids of trenches and deeper dugouts, elaborately camouflaged, provided for the assembling and maintenance of the supporting troops. Behind these again, in modest and obscure recesses, lay the brigade headquarters, behind which again the group of heavy and medium batteries were disposed in studied irregular array. Favored by beautiful weather and a quiet day, we were able, by taking care, to make our way into the ruins of Avion village, in which, in 2s and 3s, the keen-eyed Canadian sharpshooters maintained their ceaseless bickering against the German outposts 50 or 100 yards away. I must frankly admit that all that I saw, both in the line and of the minutely perfected organization far to the rear, inspired me with confidence in the strength of the defensive system which had gradually developed as the war proceeded. Holding the convictions which this volume describes of the relative power of offense and defense under modern conditions, I looked forward, at least so far as this sector was concerned, to the day when the Germans would taste a measure of that bitter draught our armies had been made to drink so long. Alas, the conditions here were by no means representative of the general state of the line. It is no disparagement of the qualities of Sir William Robertson to record the very great pleasure with which I learned of the appointment of Sir Henry Wilson to be the chief of the staff. We had known each other for many years. I had met him first by the banks of the Tugela in February 1900, and my first picture of him is a haggard but jocular major emerging from a bloody night's work in the Peters Hill fighting. It was in discussion with him from 1910 onwards that I had studied the problem of a war between France and Germany. Though I recorded at the time somewhat different conclusions about the opening phase from those on which he proceeded, my debt to him was very great. Never shall I forget the memorable forecast which, in August 1911, during the Agadir crisis, he had given to the Committee of Imperial Defense. At this period we were close confederates. The crisis passed away, and the Irish quarrel sundered our personal relations. A devoted son of Ulster, he resented with a passion which knew no bounds the Home Rule policy of the Liberal government. During the intense days which preceded the British declaration of war upon Germany, we were forced to meet on several occasions, but on a purely official basis. The mobilization of the fleet and the final decision to join France, in which I had played my part, carried all before them in Wilson's heart. But this I did not know, and it was with surprise that one August morning I received at the Admiralty a visit of ceremony from him on the eve of his departure for France. He had come to say that all past differences were obliterated and that we were friends again. He was opposed later on to the Dardanelles expedition. At that time he saw the war only in the light of the struggle in France. Had he commanded a central point of view, he would perhaps have had a different opinion. At any rate, his policy as chief of the staff was far wider in its scope than the Western Front. But these disagreements did not, so far as I am aware, impair our personal relations, and when later on I served in France as a battalion commander, he showed me every courtesy and often discussed the whole situation, military and political, with the freedom we had practiced at Whitehall in days when my position was superior. His appointment as chief of the staff led immediately to the closest harmony between the spheres of strategy and material. The conceptions of war which I held, and which these pages record, received from him a keen and pregnant welcome. Almost his first act was to raise the War Office demand for the Tank Corps from 18,000 to 46,000 men. In Sir Henry Wilson, the War Cabinet found for the first time an expert adviser of superior intellect, who could explain lucidly and forcefully the whole situation and give reasons for the adoption or rejection of any course. Such gifts are, whether rightly or wrongly, the object of habitual distrust in England. But they are certainly a very great comfort in the transaction of public business. Sir Henry Wilson constantly corrected the clarity of his mind by whimsical mannerisms and modes of expression. He spoke in parables, used curious images and cryptic phrases. He had a vocabulary of his own. The politicians were frogs, Clemenceau always the tiger. He even addressed him as Tiger. His faithful aide-de-camp, Duncannon, was the Lord. He wantonly pronounced grotesquely the names of French towns and generals. In discussing the gravest matters, he used the modes of levity. "Prime Minister," he began one day to the War Cabinet at a meeting which I attended, "today I am Boche." Then followed a penetrating description of the situation from the standpoint of the German headquarters. On another day he would be France or Bulgaria, and always out of this affection there emerged, to my mind, the root of the matter in hand. But some ministers were irritated. He did not go so far as Marshal Foch, who sometimes gave a military description in pantomime. But their methods of displaying a war proposition had much in common. I can see him so clearly as I write, standing before the map in the cabinet room, giving one of his terse telegraphies appreciations. "This morning, sir, a new battle." The reader will recognize it when it comes. This time it is we who have attacked. We have attacked with 2 armies, one British, one French. Sir Haig is in his train, Prime Minister very uncomfortable, near the good city of Amiens, and Raleigh in his left hand and Debeny in his right. Footnote. Raleigh is General Rawlinson. End of footnote. Raleigh is using 500 tanks. It is a big battle, and we thought you would not like us to tell you about it beforehand. I cannot vouch for the actual words, but this was the sense and manner of it. We should be thankful that the future is veiled. I was to be present at another scene in this room. There was no Henry Wilson. The Prime Minister and I faced each other, and on the table between us lay the pistols which an hour before had drunk this loyal man's blood. I have strayed alike from narrative and chronology to make in deep respect this reference to the most comprehending military mind of our day in Britain, and to a soldier who, although he commanded no armies, exerted on occasion a profound and fortunate influence over the greatest events. With Sir Henry Wilson as his deputy came the brilliant Harrington, who at Plumer's side had won for the Second Army its unequalled reputation. I think I may say that in all that concerned the making of the weapons for the campaign in 1919, with their inevitable profound reactions upon its plans, we thought as one. He supported me in all my principal projects for the supply of the armies, and used, under Sir Henry Wilson, the whole power of the General Staff to carry forward the plans for the great mechanical battle which we trusted, however late in the day, would bring finality. I had also in the War Office at this time a friend in General Furse, the Master General of the Ordnance. He had commanded the division in which I had served during the few months I was at the front, and we had many times argued out the kind of projects I was now in a position to put forward. To ensure the closest contact in the vast artillery sphere, I appointed him, with Lord Milner's approval. Footnote, Lord Milner had now succeeded Lord Derby at the War Office, end of footnote, to be an actual member of the Munitions Council. Thus all these far-reaching and, though subordinate, yet vital controls pulled together from this time forward, and we had to worry only about the enemy. In this favorable atmosphere, at the beginning of March I completed a general survey of the war, ostensibly from the munitions standpoint, and unfolded the argument for the mechanical battle. To the War Cabinet, March 5, 1918. Munitions Program 1919. First, so far as munitions are concerned, the year 1918 is settled for good or for ill. No decisive changes in our modes of warfare can be produced in time to influence the campaign now opening. But it is imperative to decide quite soon what the character of the campaign of 1919 is to be. It is no use considering such a question in October or November. Practically a whole year's notice is required for any great development in material. We ought to have made up our minds by the beginning of April what the main principles and general outlines of our munitions program for 1919 are to be. I would ask that this task may be undertaken at once. Second, we are immediately confronted with the fundamental question, how are we going to win the war in 1919? It seems to me a reasonable expectation, if every effort is made and unity prevails, that by the end of this year we shall have established three very substantial facts which are now disputed. 1. Either the German will have attacked in the West and have been repulsed, or he will have exposed himself incapable of delivering an offensive on a great scale. 2. The submarine warfare will have entered upon a phase in which our tonnage will be greater at the end of every month and not less as at present. 3. The growing American army will be becoming a real and great military factor. It is possible we may add a 4 to this, that is, a definite and unmistakable ascendancy in the air, both as regards numbers and quality. All these aims have of course to be fought for and worked for during the ensuing months. They are reasonable objects of endeavor. Failure to attain any of them would be disastrous to us. Our success, on the other hand, in attaining all of them will not necessarily be fatal to the enemy. Third, A. We must further assume that a new front will be made against the enemy in the east by Japanese armies being brought as deeply as possible into Russia, and by every conceivable inducement being offered to Japan to come directly into collision and contact with the German forces. It will further be necessary to stop the spread of German influence towards India through Persia. This can only be done by sending without delay sufficient troops to dominate the Persian situation, as was done by the Grand Duke in 1915 with such successful results. B. We must assume that while Germany is absorbing and dragooning Russia, Great Britain will continue to break up and devour Turkey as an offset, albeit unequal. C. We may balance the chances of an internal collapse in Italy against those of an internal collapse in Austria, it being assumed, however, that we shall do as much to help Italy as Germany has done since the beginning of the war for her allies. Fourth, all these perilous matters being accomplished will bring us to the campaign of 1919, and if we get so far, the question repeats itself. How are we going to win then? If there is no method of winning then which military men can discover, it will certainly be argued by many that it would be better to make peace at the least unfavorable moment in the present year, abandoning altogether the hope of a decisive victory in the war. It therefore becomes of the very highest consequence to discover what is the best plan for 1919, and whether there is any plan or use we can make of our resources which will give us a reasonable hope of a military victory. Fifth, it is clear that a military victory, apart from internal collapse, can only be reached by offensive action, and that offensive action can only be based on overwhelming superiority in one form or another. Even if all the favorable assumptions made in the earlier paragraphs of this paper are borne out, it is clear that no overwhelming superiority will be available for us in several of the main elements of war. For instance, we cannot expect any sufficient preponderance in manpower in 1919, even with the American armies, to enable us to overwhelm by numbers the German front in the West. The best it is reasonable to hope is that the two sides will be of about the same relative strength as in 1917 before the Russian collapse. Even this is highly disputable. On the other hand, we may fairly reckon on a good superiority in quality, which added to the improvement in numbers will give us, once again in the West, undoubtedly the stronger armies. Still, the margin will not be enough to offer any prospect of a military victory by manpower. Sixth, there does not either seem to be any good prospect of winning a military victory through an overwhelming superiority in guns and shells. We are already at the limit of our shell production. We cannot expect that the tonnage of 1919 will, at the very best, do more than enable us, having regard to our depleting stocks, to maintain our 1918 standards. These give us no marked superiority over the enemy. Further, the limits of what can be effected by gunpower have been coming very clearly into view. We see that after a certain point it tends to defeat its own purposes as an offensive weapon, for the ground is so ploughed up by the necessary artillery preparation that it is impossible for troops to advance over it. It is a very practical and pregnant question at the moment whether artillery has not been overdone, and whether, in the disposition of our resources for 1919, both personnel and material should not be liberated from artillery for other forms of warfare. I will return to this later. Seventh, again it is clear that our policy of blockade on which the Navy have hitherto relied can no longer be counted upon to produce decisive results now that the Germans have got enormous portions of Russia at their disposal. Indeed, we are likely during the period under survey to suffer nearly as much inconvenience and political instability through lack of supplies as are our enemies. I therefore return to the fundamental question. If you cannot starve out your enemy, if you cannot bear him down by numbers or blast him from your path with artillery, how are you going to win? Eighth, I wish to avow, however, at this stage in the argument, that the method and the means do exist by which in 1919 the German armies in the West could be decisively defeated and their front effectively broken up. No proposition of this kind can be stated in terms of certainty, because there are no certainties in war. But I believe that if the right decisions are taken now, it should be possible to impart to the British armies in particular, and to the Allied armies in general, a means of continuous forward progression in 1919, which, if successful, would yield decisive results, and that the chances of success are good enough to justify the prolongation of the struggle in the meanwhile. I will proceed to indicate in general terms the lines of thought to which attention should be directed in order to realize the result. Part 2. Ninth. Wars have hitherto been conducted by infantry, cavalry and artillery, and these are the three recognized arms of the service. It has also been observed with some truth that the infantry is the army, and uses the other arms as its adjuncts. Whichever way the question is viewed, it is clear that there are no means of obtaining an overwhelming superiority sufficient to enable a continuous advance to be made by any developments which it is in our power to make in the infantry, cavalry, and artillery in 1919. However, in the present war at least, 4 new arms of the highest consequence have come into being, that is, aeroplanes, tanks, gas, and machine guns. If we are to obtain the necessary superiority and the means of effective progression against the enemy, it can only be by developments of a far-reaching character in these new methods of warfare. 10th. And let it here be observed that every one of these 4 new arms has already played or shown itself capable of playing a decisive part in the present war, in spite of the fact that they have only been tardily and partially and doubtingly developed. For instance, it is the machine gun which has made the defensive hitherto invincible. Again, if either side possessed the power to drop not 5 tons, but 500 tons of bombs each night on the cities and manufacturing establishments of its opponent, the result would be decisive. If the Germans had used poison gas on a sufficiently large scale the first time they used it at all, and before we were provided with effective masks, they could undoubtedly have broken up our whole front in the West. Similarly, if we had developed tanks in secret, or at any rate in mystery, till we had about 2,000, and then had used them as they were used at the Battle of Cambrai, only on a much larger scale, and with carefully husbanded reserves of infantry to follow them up, we in turn might have broken up the German front and driven their armies into a continuous retreat. We are clearly in the presence of new factors, all of which possess decisive qualities. 11th. It must, however, be remembered that the total quantity of our resources is limited, and that the decision which has to be taken is one which involves the development of these new arms, both in men and material, to a very large extent at the expense of the old. Still, it is contended that this should be boldly faced, that we should create, in order to attack the enemy in 1919, an army essentially different in its composition and methods of warfare from any that have yet been employed on either side. This would only be in accordance with the obvious principle that if you cannot get a sufficient superiority over your opponent in the same methods as he employs, you should break away and develop different and unexpected variants. Thus we may contemplate a. Relieving the want of manpower in the infantry, especially on defensive sectors of the front, by great increases of machine guns, automatic rifles, and the like, or b. Putting most of the cavalry into tanks or other mechanical vehicles, or c. Drawing upon the artillery and the material which supplies it, as far as may be needed to raise chemical warfare to its proper proportionate position in our organization. It is unnecessary to speak of the air, for that is already accepted. We have undoubtedly the power at the present time of making such decisions fully effective for 1919 if we act without delay and upon a carefully thought out and ruthlessly pursued plan. The question is essentially one of proportion, but it is not capable of being solved unless the old proportions are definitely put aside and revolutionary changes in the composition of the armies and in their methods of warfare are unhesitatingly faced. 12th. On the other hand, we need not exaggerate the extent of the changes which would be necessary. Let us assume, the figures are of course only tokens, that at the present time our military effort in men and material combined is expressed as follows: infantry 40%, artillery 40%, air 10%, cavalry 3.5%, machine guns 4%, tanks 2%, gas 0.5%. The kind of change that is suggested might be expressed as follows: infantry 35%, artillery 30%, air 15%, cavalry 0.5%, machine guns 7%, tanks 8%, gas 4.5%. This would give us an army substantially different in its composition from that of its opponents and capable of confronting him with offensive propositions fundamentally different in character from those which he has hitherto disposed of. As stated above, the air expansion is already practically conceded. The development of machine guns and automatic rifles is also to a great extent assured. But the two most vital of the new arms, namely tanks and gas, are at present only used on a miniature and experimental scale. 13th. Yet in both of these we have immense advantages, inherent or acquired, over the enemy. Incomparably, the most effective method of discharging gas is by liberating it from cylinders to form a gas cloud when the wind is favorable. In no other way can results on the largest scale be achieved. Although for some time we and the Germans have relied instead upon firing gas shells from guns or mortars, there is no doubt that the original method, in spite of its difficulty and danger, is by far the most formidable. It is undoubtedly possible, if the wind is favorable, to discharge gas over a wide front which, if the discharge is sufficiently prolonged or intense, will render all existing masks ineffectual. The supreme fact is that the wind is at least 6 times, and some say 9 times, as favorable to us as it is to the enemy. We are mad not to avail ourselves of this overwhelming advantage. But with our present pitifully small gas service of perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 men, we are only trifling with the problem. 14th. Again, take tanks. Here our advantage is due to our having started far in advance of the enemy and having with painful slowness but extreme thoroughness explored the difficulties, tactical and manufacturing, of this highly complicated arm. The element of novelty has now been thrown away, but numbers, quality, organization and training still affords us opportunities of the first order if we only had the wisdom and resolution to profit by them. The year 1919 is still at our disposal. It is undoubtedly within our power to construct in very large numbers armored vehicles of various types, some to fight, some to pursue, some to cut wire and trample trenches, some to carry forward men or machine gun parties, or artillery, or supplies, to such an extent and on such a scale that 150,000 to 200,000 fighting men can be carried forward certainly and irresistibly on a broad front and to a depth of 8 or 10 miles in the course of a single day. The resources are available, the knowledge is available, the time is available. The result is certain. Nothing is lacking except the will. We have never been able to get out of the rut of traditional and conventional methods. We have never been able to plan on a sufficiently large scale, long in advance, and with the necessary force and authority to drive the policy through. We have instead only carried out a series of costly experiments, each of which has shown us the chance we have lost and exposed our thought to the enemy. 15th. It surely lies with those who shake their heads to say on what alternative method of attack or on what alternative form of superiority they can rely to win a military victory in 1919. Where are they going to get the numerical superiority which they had in the autumn of 1916 and the spring of 1917, and which was then found not to be sufficient? What more can artillery do in offense than it has already done in the great battles of this year and last? What grounds are there for supposing that we possess more staying power or more national discipline than the Germans? What more is to be looked for from the blockade? If there is an alternative plan, let us have it. If not, let this one have its fair chance. Let it be backed with as good an effort as was given to the creation of the British artillery in 1915 and 1916. Let other interests be made to concede and conform to its essential requirements. Surely we ought to have a plan for which we can strive, and not simply go carrying on from day to day and from hand to mouth in the hopes of something turning up before we reach the final abyss of general anarchy and world famine. 16th. There is a short way of ending this war. It is to defeat the German armies in the West. For this purpose 2 conditions are necessary. First, we must have stronger and better armies ourselves. That is the foundation on which everything rests, and there is no reason why we should not have it in 1919. Secondly, we must discover a method of the offensive which enables these stronger armies to advance at a certain moderate rate of progression along their selected strategical lines. The problem is therefore definite and precise. Indeed, it is mainly mechanical. Discover a method by which a stronger army can regain its rightful power of continuous advance, and decisive victory is won. It is mechanical methods which are preventing that advance. Overcome these by mechanical agency, and courage and quality will once again receive their due. Part 3. 17th. There is one other aspect of the problem to which I referred in my paper of the 21st of October last, namely the scale and intensity of a decisive conflict. War between equals in power is not an affair which can be carried to a result merely by quasi-business and administrative processes flowing smoothly out month after month and year after year. It should be a succession of climaxes on which everything is staked, toward which everything tends, and from which permanent decisions are obtained. These climaxes have usually been called battles. A battle means that the whole resources on either side that can be brought to bear are, during the course of a single episode, concentrated upon the enemy. There has not been a battle in this war since the Battle of the Marne of which this could be said. We in England particularly are misled by the increasing scale of our casualties, due to the increasing size of our armies, into thinking that the intensity of the conflict is greater now than in the opening stages of the war. The Battle of the Somme, in the period of its greatest fury, involved no more than the engagement simultaneously of about 20 British and French divisions against probably half that number of Germans. And the Battle of Verdun ceased when the Battle of the Somme had begun. All the great operations of 1916 and 1917, although so prolonged as to cause very heavy losses, have involved the simultaneous employment only of comparatively small forces on comparatively small fronts. The armies have been fighting in installments. They have engaged perhaps 8 or 10% of their total strength. 18th. The reasons which have led to this are well known. The power of the defense is such that practically the whole spare artillery of an army has to be collected to support a single attack, in which there is no room for more than a tenth of the available troops. There has never been, and there will never be, enough artillery to enable, say, 6 battles of Messines to be fought at one and the same moment. And thus the war in the West has dwindled down to siege operations on a gigantic scale, which, however bloody and prolonged, cannot yield a decisive result. Thus, when a great battle is raging on the British front, 6 or 8 British divisions are fighting desperately. Half a dozen others are waiting to sustain them. The rest of the front is calm. 20 British divisions are remaining quietly in their trenches, doing their daily routine. Another 20 are training behind the lines. 20,000 men are at school, 10,000 are playing football, 100,000 are on leave. It is the same with the enemy. Obviously, we have passed out of the region where the scale and intensity of the operations can be decisive on the great armies which are in presence of each other. Still less can they be decisive on the great belligerent nations. The idea of ending the war by killing Germans is a delusion. You have got to kill or totally incapacitate at least 700,000 Germans in every year, that is, a number equal to the annual increment, before the slightest progress is made towards wearing down their manhood. And it takes at least one man's life to kill a German. We have to be, in short, merely exchanging lives, and exchanging lives upon a scale at once more frightful than anything that has been witnessed before in the world, and too modest to produce a decision. 19th. Contrast this with the first two shocks of the war in the West, namely the first collision on the frontiers or the supreme struggle at the Marne. In the first 3 weeks of the war, between the 20th of August and the 10th or 12th of September, the whole of the French and German armies, every division, every available man, were simultaneously, continuously, or repeatedly engaged in open and moving warfare. The Battle of the Marne, for instance, comprised not only those operations near Paris of which we have read, but a general battle on a front beginning 50 kilometers west of Paris right up to Verdun, and then round the corner, far down past Nancy into Alsace. A total of certainly not less than 350 kilometers, along the whole of which the armies were at death grips, hurling their last reserves at each other. The French, although ultimately victorious, lost more men in the first 20 days of fighting than in the whole of the year 1917. The tempo of the war has progressively languished. It has steadily declined into a deadlock more perilous and more agonizing, more disintegrating in its effects upon the world than any decision of armies, however sharp. 20th. Until the arrival of the Americans in force, that is to say during the whole of this year, we are not in a position, without running a desperate risk, to seek a general battle. But next year, in 1919, we may again be unmistakably superior in strength. It will then be right to fight a battle, that is to say to seek a military decision for which the whole strength of the armies is employed. Every man, every gun, every resource, within an exceedingly limited number of days. But how? By what means can we overcome the physical and mechanical difficulties that have hitherto imposed such severe limitations on our actions? Possibly 3 times as many men as the enemy would be one way. We shall never have them. 3 or 4 times as much artillery as we have at present might be another way. We shall never get it. There only remain these novel methods, good in themselves, better still in combination with the older methods. If on the British front we can only afford the concentrated artillery necessary to sustain, say, 2 great simultaneous attacks, and the French an equal number, must we not look for substitutes which will enable other attacks, supported only by the local artillery, to be delivered at the same time? Gas will certainly give you one of these. Tanks, if we develop them, could give us at least 2 of the highest order. Possibly, trench mortars might offer another means. If the French and American armies followed similar methods, there is no reason why we should not once more see a general battle on a 300-kilometer front, applying in its brief course the whole strength of our stronger attacking armies, and yet with each attack supported by some scientific method which overcame the wire and machine guns of the defense. That would be war proceeding by design through crisis to decision. Not mere waste and slaughter, sagging slowly downwards into general collapse. The fury of the storm was now about to break upon us, and these arguments were soon to be illustrated and corrected by flaming events. Ludendorff, reintroducing the great battle period and consuming the German strength in desperate offensives without the necessary mechanical weapons and vehicles, was destined to bring about the Allied general battle on a 300-kilometer front which ended the war, and to bring it about after periods of awful peril 1 year earlier than our best plans could have achieved.